Paris, 1942. A Nazi propaganda poster hangs on a wall near the Champs-Élysées. At first glance, it's typical German occupation propaganda. Bold text urging French workers to volunteer for labor in Germany, promising good wages and comfortable conditions. The artwork is professionally done, colorful, eye-catching. German authorities approved it. Thousands of copies plaster Paris and other French cities. But look closer. The artist who created this poster was French, working under Nazi supervision. And hidden within the seemingly loyal propaganda are tiny acts of sabotage. The German soldier depicted has a subtly mocking expression. The factory in the background, meant to look productive, has smokestacks that don't quite align correctly, suggesting dysfunction. The typography, while appearing correct, contains letters with microscopic flaws that spell out resistance messages when decoded. This poster, approved by Nazi censors, is actually anti-Nazi sabotage, disguised as collaboration. This was the Invisible War. While French resistance fighters planted bombs and sabotaged railways, French artists fought a different kind of battle, using their skills to undermine Nazi propaganda from within. They worked in German-controlled studios, designing posters and publications that appeared to serve the occupation, while secretly embedding resistance messages, subtle mockery, and psychological sabotage that Nazi censors never detected. Welcome to Cipher Tales. Today, we decode one of World War II's most ingenious resistance operations: how French artists turned propaganda into sabotage. This is the story of painters, illustrators, graphic designers, and printmakers who became secret weapons, fighting fascism with brushstrokes and hidden symbols. They couldn't openly resist without being executed, so they resisted invisibly, embedding their defiance in the very propaganda meant to subjugate their country. This is the story of artists who turned collaboration into resistance, who made every poster a small victory, and who proved that creativity can be the most subversive weapon of all. The occupation. Artists under Nazi control. To understand how French artists sabotaged Nazi propaganda, we must first understand the impossible situation they faced under German occupation. When France fell in June 1940, French cultural life came under Nazi control, and artists confronted terrible choices with no good options. The Nazi occupation of France was both military conquest and cultural assault. Hitler coveted Paris as the jewel of European civilization, and the Germans sought to control not just French territory, but French culture itself. The occupation authorities established strict censorship over all media, publications, and artistic production. Nothing could be printed, published, or publicly displayed without German approval. For French artists, this created existential dilemmas. Many depended on their art for livelihood. They needed to work to survive and support families. But working meant potentially serving the Nazi occupation. Refusing to work might mean starvation, or worse, deportation to labor camps or execution for resistance activity. The choice seemed to be between collaboration and destruction. Some prominent French artists fled to unoccupied zones or abroad. Picasso remained in Paris but refused to work for German authorities. Others withdrew from public artistic life entirely, creating nothing rather than creating for Nazis. But many artists, particularly commercial artists, illustrators, and graphic designers working in publishing and advertising, didn't have these options. They weren't famous enough to survive on reputation alone, and they lacked resources to flee or stop working. The German authorities quickly took control of French publishing and propaganda infrastructure. They established the Propagandastaffel, an organization controlling all French media and cultural production. Printing houses, publishing companies, advertising agencies, and design studios came under German supervision. Artists working in these industries found themselves reporting to Nazi overseers who approved or rejected their work based on whether it served occupation objectives. The Germans needed French artists. German propaganda operations in occupied France required French-language materials created by people who understood French culture, visual preferences, and communication styles. German propagandists could write messages, but they needed French artists to make those messages visually appealing to French audiences. This created opportunities for subtle resistance that German authorities couldn't detect. French artists working under occupation faced constant moral anguish. Every poster they designed, every illustration they created, every publication they worked on potentially served Nazi purposes. They wrestled with questions of complicity and resistance. Were they collaborators if they worked for German-controlled companies? Could they morally justify earning their livelihood by creating materials that might support the occupation?
But some artists recognized an opportunity within this terrible situation. If they had to create propaganda, perhaps they could sabotage it from within. If Nazi censors would approve their work, perhaps those censors could be deceived. What if resistance could hide inside apparent collaboration? What if the very propaganda meant to subjugate France could be turned against its creators through subtle, invisible subversion? This realization sparked one of World War II's most creative resistance operations. French artists began deliberately embedding resistance messages, mockery, and psychological sabotage into Nazi-approved propaganda. They became double agents of a sort, appearing to loyally serve the occupation while actually undermining it through their art. It was dangerous, sophisticated, and required extraordinary skill to execute without detection. The techniques. How artists sabotaged propaganda. French artists developed sophisticated techniques for sabotaging Nazi propaganda while maintaining the appearance of loyal collaboration. Understanding these methods reveals both artistic creativity and psychological warfare sophistication. The most fundamental technique was subtle visual mockery embedded in imagery. A propaganda poster showing German soldiers might depict them with expressions that seemed confident at first glance, but actually conveyed arrogance or foolishness when examined closely. An artist would draw a German officer's face with technically correct anatomy, but with microscopic adjustments to proportions that created subtly ridiculous or pompous appearance. These visual jokes required extraordinary skill. The mockery had to be subtle enough that German censors wouldn't notice, but present enough that perceptive French viewers would recognize it. Artists exploited the fact that Nazi censors weren't trained in visual arts and couldn't detect sophisticated artistic techniques. A slight adjustment to eye position, a barely perceptible smirk, a posture that suggested weakness rather than strength. These tiny details changed meaning without obviously violating propaganda requirements. Color symbolism carried hidden messages. French artists used colors associated with French resistance or Free France in ways that seemed innocent but communicated defiance to informed viewers. Blue, white, and red, French flag colors, would appear in compositions in patterns that subtly evoked French patriotism. A propaganda poster, ostensibly about German-French cooperation, might have background elements colored in tricolored patterns that eagle-eyed French viewers would recognize as resistance symbols. Typography became a sabotage tool. French artists would microscopically malform certain letters in propaganda text in patterns that spelled out hidden messages. An artist might slightly alter the V character throughout a poster, making it more prominent or distinctive as a reference to Churchill's V for Victory symbol that had become a resistance icon. German censors reviewing text for content wouldn't notice minuscule typography variations, but French printers and artists who knew what to look for could decode the hidden messages. Symbolic imagery embedded resistance references. French artists would include objects, animals, or background details that had significance in French culture or resistance networks. A rooster, symbol of France, might appear subtly in a poster's background. A Lorraine cross, symbol of Free France, could be hidden in architectural elements or shadows. These symbols went unnoticed by German censors unfamiliar with French cultural iconography, but communicated solidarity with French patriots who recognized them. Deliberate mistakes undermined propaganda effectiveness. Artists would create technically proficient work that nevertheless contained subtle flaws designed to reduce propaganda impact. Text placement that was slightly off-optimal, making the message less prominent. Color choices that were acceptable but less appealing than alternatives. Compositions that met German requirements but lacked the visual power to be truly persuasive. The propaganda technically worked, but didn't work well. Some artists created propaganda with double meanings. A poster encouraging French workers to volunteer for German labor programs might depict factories and machinery in ways that suggested danger and oppression rather than opportunity. The text would say what Germans wanted, but the imagery would subconsciously communicate opposite messages. French viewers seeing these posters would read the text but be influenced by visual elements suggesting that volunteering was actually dangerous. Production sabotage complemented artistic sabotage. French printers working on Nazi propaganda would deliberately make small errors that reduced quality. They'd use slightly wrong ink mixtures, creating colors that were less vibrant. They'd adjust printing press settings to produce slightly blurred images. They'd claim paper shortages required using lower quality stock. These technical sabotage acts made propaganda less visually appealing and less effective at persuading audiences. Network communication used art as covert messaging. Resistance networks sometimes embedded coded information in published materials. An artist might include specific symbols or image elements that communicated intelligence to other resistance members, meeting times, locations, warnings about German operations. These codes appeared to be normal artistic choices to outsiders, but carried specific meanings to those trained to decode them. Time delays were passive sabotage. Artists working on Nazi propaganda projects would work slowly, taking longer than necessary to complete assignments. They'd request multiple revisions, claim materials were unavailable, or argue that designs needed more refinement. This slowed propaganda production, reducing its volume and impact. German overseers couldn't easily prove deliberate delays versus legitimate artistic process.
The Resistance Network, artists organizing. French artist saboteurs didn't work in isolation. They formed networks, loose collaborations that shared techniques, coordinated actions, and provided mutual support during the dangerous work of undermining Nazi propaganda from within. These networks operated with extreme caution. Direct communication was dangerous. German counterintelligence and French collaborationist police hunted resistance networks aggressively. Discovery meant torture, deportation to concentration camps, or execution. Artists communicated through indirect channels, using trusted intermediaries, coded messages, and careful operational security. Some networks centered on particular workplaces. Artists employed at the same printing house or publishing company would recognize each other's subtle resistance through their work. A graphic designer noticing symbolic resistance elements in a colleague's artwork would know that colleague was sympathetic. Trust would build gradually through these unspoken communications before any direct contact occurred. Art schools and pre-war artistic communities provided cover for networking. Artists who'd known each other before the occupation could maintain contact without suspicion. They were simply old friends and colleagues staying in touch. These legitimate relationships masked resistance coordination, allowing artists to share sabotage techniques while appearing to simply discuss professional matters. The networks shared intelligence about German censors' blind spots. Artists who worked directly with German propaganda overseers would learn which Nazi officials were sophisticated enough to detect subtle subversion and which were too ignorant of art to notice anything beyond obvious content. This intelligence helped the network understand what sabotage techniques were safe to use with particular German supervisors. Technical knowledge was shared collectively. An artist who discovered a new way to embed resistance symbols would discreetly share this technique with trusted colleagues. A printer who learned how to deliberately produce inferior propaganda quality would teach others. This knowledge transfer multiplied the network's effectiveness, allowing sabotage techniques to spread across French artistic communities. Some networks maintained connections with broader French resistance organizations. While most artist-saboteurs weren't involved in armed resistance, some communicated with resistance networks, providing intelligence about German propaganda priorities, upcoming campaigns, or information gleaned from working closely with German authorities. This intelligence helped resistance organizations understand German strategic communications planning. The networks provided psychological support that was perhaps as important as tactical coordination. Artists working on Nazi propaganda while secretly sabotaging it faced tremendous moral and psychological stress. They appeared to be collaborators, which meant facing scorn from French patriots who didn't know about their hidden resistance. Network connections provided reassurance that they weren't actually traitors, that their sabotage mattered, and that others shared their dangerous secret. Protection mechanisms developed within networks. If one artist was arrested by German authorities, network members would quickly remove or destroy evidence that might implicate others. They'd warn connected artists to cease sabotage activities temporarily until the danger passed. They'd sometimes attempt to help arrested members, providing money for families, securing lawyers, or even facilitating escapes when possible. Young artists and art students were sometimes recruited into resistance networks by more established professionals. A respected artist might identify a talented student who demonstrated anti-Nazi sentiments and gradually introduce them to sabotage concepts. This recruitment was extraordinarily careful. Suggesting resistance activity to someone who might inform the authorities was suicidal, but it ensured that resistance knowledge passed to new generations of artists. The networks also coordinated propaganda boycotts when possible. If certain Nazi propaganda campaigns were particularly important or effective, artist networks would collectively attempt to delay or undermine them. Multiple artists working on the same campaign would each contribute small sabotage acts that cumulatively reduced the campaign's effectiveness significantly. Documentation was deliberately avoided. Networks maintained no written records of members, techniques, or activities. Everything was oral communication and unspoken coordination. This operational security meant that if members were captured and tortured, they couldn't reveal information they didn't have recorded. It also means that post-war, much of this resistance activity remained undocumented, invisible resistance that saved no clear evidence. Specific campaigns, sabotage in action. Several documented cases reveal how French artist sabotage operated in practice. These examples illuminate both the sophisticated techniques used and the real impact on Nazi propaganda effectiveness. One of the most famous examples involved posters for the Relied program, Nazi Germany's labor recruitment scheme, where French workers would supposedly volunteer for factory work in Germany, while French prisoners of war would be repatriated. The program was crucial to German production, and Nazi authorities commissioned extensive propaganda encouraging French workers to volunteer. French artists assigned to create Relied posters embedded multiple layers of sabotage. The imagery depicted factories and machinery, but artists drew them with subtle details suggesting danger, gears that looked menacing rather than productive, smokestacks belching oppressive, dark clouds rather than suggesting prosperous industry, workers with expressions of fear rather than enthusiasm, barely noticeable unless examined closely. Color choices were deliberately unappealing. While meeting technical requirements for the posters, artists selected color palettes that were psychologically off-putting, harsh reds suggesting danger, sickly yellows suggesting disease, cold blues suggesting isolation. The colors were technically correct, but created subconscious negative associations that undermined the propaganda's persuasive intent. Typography was manipulated. The word relied appeared in typefaces that artists deliberately made slightly uncomfortable to read, letter spacing that was acceptable but not optimal, fonts that were technically legible but not inviting. German censors approved the text as readable, but the subtle typography choices reduced the poster's visual impact. Most ingeniously, some artists embedded tiny resistance symbols. In shadows of machinery, shapes formed subtle Lorraine crosses. In background crowds of workers, individual figures were positioned to create the letter V when viewed from particular angles. In decorative borders, patterns incorporated resistance imagery at scales too small for German censors to notice, but visible to French viewers examining posters closely. The cumulative effect was propaganda that technically satisfied German requirements, but was significantly less effective than it could have been. Post-war analysis suggested that relied poster campaigns were notably unsuccessful at recruiting volunteers, partly because the visual propaganda undermined rather than reinforced the written messages. Another documented case involved propaganda newspapers that German authorities forced French publishers to produce. These publications, collaborationist newspapers supposedly representing French support for occupation, were written by German propagandists and French collaborators, but designed and printed by French artists and typesetters who often secretly opposed the occupation. Sabotage occurred at multiple production stages. Graphic designers would lay out pages in ways that technically followed German instructions, but subtly reduced readability and visual appeal. They'd place important propaganda articles in less prominent positions. They'd select unflattering photographs of German officials when multiple options were available. They'd create headlines that were technically correct but lacked the dramatic impact that effective propaganda required. Typesetters engaged in micro-sabotage. They'd introduce tiny typographic errors, misaligned letters, slightly inconsistent spacing, microscopic flaws that reduced reading comfort without being obviously wrong. They'd claim these were inevitable with available equipment and materials. German editors couldn't prove deliberate sabotage, but the cumulative effect was newspapers that were less professional and less persuasive than optimal. Printers conducted quality sabotage. They'd use ink mixtures that produced acceptable but not excellent print quality. They'd run presses at speeds that created slight blurring. They'd use paper that was adequate but not ideal. Every small quality reduction made the propaganda less effective at influencing readers. Some sabotage was more aggressive. Printers would occasionally accidentally destroy print runs, claiming mechanical failures or material defects. Thousands of propaganda copies would be lost, requiring reprinting that delayed distribution. German authorities would be frustrated, but couldn't prove the accidents were deliberate. A particularly clever example involved posters encouraging French citizens to report resistance activity to German authorities. Artists created these anti-resistance posters, but deliberately made them visually threatening and unappealing. The imagery was so aggressive and the tone so harsh that instead of encouraging cooperation with German authorities, the posters actually reinforced the impression that Germans were oppressive occupiers. French citizens seeing these posters felt intimidated rather than motivated to collaborate. The risks. Artists who paid the price. Artist sabotage was extraordinarily dangerous. Nazi authorities and French collaborationist police aggressively hunted resistance activity of all forms. Discovery of artist sabotage meant imprisonment, deportation, torture, or execution. Several documented cases revealed the terrible prices some artists paid for their hidden resistance. Jean Brulaire, who worked under the pseudonym Vercours, was a French illustrator who published clandestine resistance literature under German occupation. While Brulaire's work was underground publishing rather than sabotaging official propaganda, his arrest and interrogation revealed how Nazi authorities responded to artists who resisted. Brulaire was tortured by Gestapo agents attempting to force him to reveal other resistance members. He survived, but bore physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. Several lesser-known artists were less fortunate. French archives document cases of graphic designers and printers arrested for suspected sabotage of propaganda materials. In some instances, German authorities detected resistance symbols embedded in published materials and tracked down the artists responsible. These artists were typically deported to concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Auschwitz, where many died from abuse, disease, or execution. The fear of discovery created constant psychological torture. Artists engaging in sabotage lived knowing that any moment could bring Gestapo arrest. They watched colleagues and friends disappear, arrested for various resistance activities, or simply disappeared by German security services. They knew their sabotage work might be detected. The German censors might eventually notice the subtle mockery and symbols they embedded in propaganda. Families were endangered by artist resistance work. Nazi collective punishment policies meant that arrested resistance members' families could be imprisoned or killed. Artists who chose to sabotage propaganda weren't just risking their own lives, but potentially condemning wives, children, and parents to terrible fates. This knowledge made resistance decisions agonizing. Was secret sabotage work worth potentially destroying one's entire family? Some artists were betrayed by French collaborators. Not all French citizens opposed the occupation. Some actively supported it, whether from ideological agreement with fascism, opportunism, or fear. French collaborators working in publishing and propaganda industries might notice colleagues' suspicious behavior and report them to German authorities. Artist saboteurs had to fear not just German surveillance, but betrayal by French co-workers. The psychological toll was devastating, even for artists who avoided arrest. Living double lives, appearing to be collaborators while secretly resisting, created profound cognitive dissonance and moral anguish. Artists questioned whether their sabotage was meaningful enough to justify the terrible compromises they made. They dealt with scorn from French patriots who saw them working for German-controlled companies and assumed they were traitors. After the war, some artist saboteurs faced accusations of collaboration despite their hidden resistance. Post-war French society conducted épuration, purges of collaborators that sometimes caught people who'd actually been resistance members, but whose resistance had been invisible. Artists who'd worked in German-controlled propaganda industries had to prove their sabotage activities, which was difficult when those activities had been deliberately hidden and undocumented.
One tragic documented case involved an illustrator who'd embedded resistance symbols in Nazi propaganda for years, working carefully to avoid detection. After liberation, he was arrested as a suspected collaborator because his published work appeared to support the occupation. Despite testimony from resistance members confirming his sabotage activities, he spent months in prison before finally being cleared. The psychological damage from being treated as a traitor after years of dangerous resistance work was profound. Some artists never received recognition for their resistance work. They died during the war, were executed by Nazis, perished in concentration camps, or simply never disclosed their sabotage activities after liberation. Their contributions remained invisible, their resistance unacknowledged, their names forgotten by history. They fought secret wars that left no monuments or medals. The impact. Did artistic sabotage matter? Assessing the effectiveness of French artists' sabotage is challenging, but evidence suggests it meaningfully reduced Nazi propaganda effectiveness and contributed to French resistance morale during occupation. The most direct evidence comes from German propaganda assessments. Declassified German documents reveal that Nazi authorities were frustrated with French propaganda campaigns' limited effectiveness. Internal reports complained that despite massive resource investment, German propaganda in France failed to generate expected French cooperation with occupation policies. Germans attributed this partly to French cultural resistance, but couldn't identify specific sabotage occurring within propaganda production. The Relied labor recruitment program provides quantifiable evidence. Despite extensive propaganda campaigns including thousands of posters, hundreds of thousands of leaflets, and constant media messaging, the program dramatically failed to meet recruitment quotas. Only a fraction of targeted French workers volunteered for German labor. Post-war analysis suggested that propaganda's unexpected ineffectiveness contributed significantly to recruitment failure, and artist sabotage was part of why propaganda was ineffective. French resistance testimony provides qualitative evidence. Resistance members interviewed after liberation sometimes mentioned noticing resistance symbols in Nazi propaganda, recognizing that fellow patriots must have embedded them. These small acts of visible resistance provided psychological encouragement, proof that resistance occurred everywhere,
even within enemy propaganda machinery itself. The psychological impact on French citizens matters even if impossible to quantify precisely. Nazi propaganda aimed to convince French people that German victory was inevitable, that cooperation with occupation was wise, and that resistance was futile. Propaganda that subtly communicated opposite messages through visual mockery, resistance symbols, and deliberate ineffectiveness undermined these German objectives. Every propaganda poster that felt wrong, that contained hidden resistance messages, that failed to persuade French audiences, was a small victory for France. Artist sabotage also had intelligence value. Information embedded in published materials sometimes reached resistance networks, Free French forces in London, or Allied intelligence services. While most artist sabotage focused on undermining propaganda effectiveness rather than communicating intelligence, some artists did manage to transmit valuable information through their work. The morale impact on artist saboteurs themselves mattered. French artists forced to work on Nazi propaganda felt profound moral anguish about their apparent collaboration. Sabotage allowed them to maintain self-respect and sense of resistance despite outward appearance of cooperation. This psychological benefit enabled artists to continue functioning during occupation rather than succumbing to despair. Network effects multiplied individual sabotage impact. Because artist saboteurs shared techniques and coordinated actions, their combined effect exceeded what isolated individuals could achieve. When multiple artists working on the same propaganda campaign each contributed small sabotage acts, the combined effect significantly reduced campaign effectiveness. Comparison with occupied countries lacking similar artist resistance suggests French artist sabotage mattered. Nazi propaganda operations in other occupied territories where less organized artist resistance occurred achieved somewhat better effectiveness at influencing populations. France's notably strong cultural resistance to Nazi propaganda derived partly from artist sabotage undermining propaganda from within. The deterrent effect also had value. German authorities, suspicious of sabotage, had to devote counterintelligence resources to monitoring artists and investigating suspected sabotage. This surveillance consumed German resources that might otherwise have been applied to hunting armed resistance networks or military operations. Perhaps most importantly, artist sabotage proved that resistance could occur everywhere, in every form, using whatever tools available. Armed resistance fighters couldn't operate in all circumstances. Cities under heavy German control, workplaces with extensive surveillance, situations where violence would provoke overwhelming retaliation. But artist resistance could occur anywhere propaganda was produced, requiring only creativity, courage, and skill.
The legacy. Artistic resistance remembered. After World War II ended and France was liberated, the story of artist saboteurs began emerging from shadows. Recognition came slowly, and the full extent of artistic resistance remains incompletely documented even decades later. Immediately after liberation, France focused on épuration, identifying and punishing collaborators. This complicated recognition of artist saboteurs, since their work had appeared to support occupation. Some artists had to defend themselves against collaboration charges before their sabotage activities were acknowledged. This painful irony, being accused of collaboration after years of dangerous resistance, traumatized several artist saboteurs who survived the war. As more documentation emerged and resistance members testified about artist networks, recognition gradually increased. French government awarded some artist saboteurs resistance medals and official acknowledgement. Museums and cultural institutions began documenting artistic resistance, collecting examples of sabotaged propaganda and recording survivor testimonies before they were lost to time. Art historians studying World War II French culture increasingly recognized artistic resistance as a significant phenomenon deserving serious academic attention. Research revealed sophisticated techniques artists used, documented specific cases of sabotage, and analyzed the psychology of resistance disguised as collaboration. This scholarship helped establish artistic resistance as a legitimate and important aspect of French wartime experience. The broader French resistance narrative gradually incorporated artist saboteurs. While armed resistance fighters initially dominated public memory of French resistance, cultural resistance, including artistic sabotage, eventually received recognition as equally important to maintaining French spirit during occupation. Artists who fought with paintbrushes and typography gained status alongside those who fought with explosives and weapons. Contemporary artists drew inspiration from World War II artist saboteurs. During subsequent conflicts, and under various authoritarian regimes, artists facing censorship and control studied French artist resistance techniques. The concept of embedding resistance within apparent compliance became part of artist resistance vocabulary worldwide. The ethical questions raised by artistic sabotage continue provoking discussion. Was it morally acceptable to appear to collaborate while secretly resisting? Did ends, resisting Nazi occupation, justify means, creating propaganda that on its surface served Nazi purposes to some degree? How should we judge artists who made these impossible choices under terrible circumstances? Some critics argue that artist saboteurs shouldn't be celebrated because they still created propaganda that, even if sabotaged, served Nazi purposes to some degree. Even ineffective propaganda was propaganda, and artists who created it were complicit in occupation, regardless of sabotage intentions. This harsh judgment reflects absolutist view that any cooperation with evil is unacceptable. Most historians and ethicists take more nuanced positions. They recognize that artists under occupation faced impossible choices with no purely good options. Refusing all work might mean death, deportation, or starvation. Creating propaganda without sabotage would be genuine collaboration. Creating propaganda while secretly sabotaging it represented a middle path, survival through apparent compliance while actually resisting. Given the terrible circumstances, this compromise seems morally defensible, even if imperfect.
The legacy extends to contemporary understanding of resistance. Artist saboteurs demonstrated that resistance doesn't always involve dramatic armed conflict. Sometimes resistance is subtle, invisible, operating within systems of control and subverting them from inside. This broadened concept of resistance recognizes that people facing oppression resist in whatever ways available, using whatever tools they possess. Modern information warfare and propaganda studies reference French artist sabotage, this early example of subversive communication within controlled media. Contemporary activists and artists facing authoritarian control study World War II French techniques, adapting them to modern contexts. The principle that propaganda can be undermined from within by those forced to create it remains relevant. The French artists who turned Nazi propaganda into sabotage during World War II fought one of history's most creative and invisible wars. They worked in studios and printing houses, creating materials that appeared to serve the occupation while actually undermining it through techniques so subtle that even many French viewers never recognized the sabotage occurring before their eyes. Their resistance required extraordinary courage of a particular kind. Armed resistance fighters faced death in combat, terrible but immediate. Artist saboteurs faced potential discovery at any moment, living years under constant threat of Gestapo torture and execution. They endured moral anguish from appearing to be collaborators, facing scorn from patriots who didn't know their secret. They risked not just their own lives, but their families' lives every time they embedded a resistance symbol or deliberately degraded propaganda quality. Yet they resisted. They resisted because they understood that every form of opposition mattered, that creativity could be weaponized, that even forced collaboration could be turned against oppressors through intelligence and skill. They proved that artists weren't helpless victims of propaganda machinery, but could be saboteurs within it, subverting every message they were forced to create. The Nazi regime never fully understood why their French propaganda campaigns were so surprisingly ineffective. They attributed it to French cultural stubbornness, to inadequate resources, to tactical errors. But part of the explanation was simpler. The very French artists creating German propaganda were actively undermining it, turning collaboration into resistance through hidden acts of defiance, embedded in every poster, every publication, every propaganda piece. The hidden symbols, the microscopic resistance markers, the subtle mockery in German officers' portraits, the tricolor patterns in supposedly pro-occupation designs communicated to aware French viewers that resistance was everywhere, that even in the propaganda meant to subjugate them, French patriots were fighting back, that not everything was as it appeared, that hope remained even in darkest places. Some of these artists paid terrible prices, arrested, tortured, deported to concentration camps, executed. Others survived but carried psychological scars from years living double lives, balancing survival against resistance, appearing to be traitors while actually being patriots. Few received recognition proportionate to their courage and contribution. If this deep dive into how French artists transformed Nazi propaganda into hidden sabotage captivated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised by how sophisticated artistic resistance could be? Can you see parallels between World War II artist sabotage and contemporary artistic resistance to authoritarianism? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? The role of underground publishers in occupied territories, how resistance movements used forged documents as propaganda, the psychology of collaboration versus resistance. Share this video with anyone fascinated by artistic resistance, the French resistance, psychological warfare, or the hidden ways people fight oppression using creativity as a weapon. Until then, remember, the most subversive art is often that which hides in plain sight, invisible to oppressors, but speaking truth to those who know how to see it. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.